turn it over.
Got it.
David, go.
Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to another episode of our Beyond Black History Month. Glad to see you all and excited to hear this great presentation today for someone who I think we're all getting to know more about over time, and clearly one of our heroes. So hand it over to our experts, and we're all ready to learn.
Well, I just want to welcome everybody and introduce one of our members of our committee. My name is Linda Crump. I would hope everybody would make sure their recording is on mute so that if there are noises in your background, it doesn't disturb the presentation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and later in the program, we'll be able to get to all of those questions. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat later that will be very informative for you. But if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure we can go forward from there. So Alvin, I'm going to turn it over to you and you can give us directions as to what you'd like. Thank you, Alvin.
Okay, thank you so much, David and Linda, and good afternoon to everyone. I really appreciate everyone coming out this afternoon to hear our conversation about someone who, as David said, is a hero and is often an unsung hero because there's so many people who don't know about her. I'm on the education committee here at ASALH. I've always been a history buff, and I'm also an attorney. But I'm ashamed to admit that I hadn't really heard about Pauli Murray until probably about 5 years ago, and now I can't get enough information about her. She's absolutely fascinating individual who played such a pivotal role in so many things that we very often just sort of ascribe to other individuals because those are the names of the people who may have, you know, argued the case before the Supreme Court, or they may have been the people who had the cases that were at the top of the news in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But today we've got a wonderful opportunity to talk about an individual, Pauli Murray, who was born in the South in 1910, raised in North Carolina, and went on to incredible academic heights, getting not only law degrees from Howard Law School, Bolt Hall in California, but ultimately a PhD from Yale Law School. How does someone from North Carolina get a PhD from Yale back in those years when almost no people of color were going to law school, and there certainly weren't very many females going to law school? But we're going to learn about that and a lot more about this incredible person, the struggles she faced in being a person of color and being a woman and being a person who today we might refer to as non-binary. She faced a lot of challenges, rose above them, put the good of people and justice, social justice, above her own personal safety and needs. And we're going to learn so much today, in large part because we have the wonderful opportunity to have our conversations today with Ms. Rosita Stevens Halsey, is someone who personally knew Pauli Murray, who is the subject of our program here today. Good afternoon, Rosita.
Good afternoon.
Rosita,
I'm so happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you here. You're an incredible person of yourself. We could probably do a program just about you and your career, but today we're going to be talking about your aunt. But let me just say for a moment here, Ms. Halsey, who I'm going to call Rosita, since she and I have been having a phone relationship for the last few months here. She was the recipient of the 2023 National Organization of Women of Vision Award for the incredible work she's been doing in carrying on the legacy of her aunt, Pauli Murray. You'll see behind her there the cover of the book that she and Ms. Terry Casadas Jennings drafted. It's a book geared toward adolescents that I will have her talk about a little bit later, but it's about the life and struggles and accomplishments of her aunt. Rosita is a former systems engineer for IBM, as well as an educator. There seems to be an education streak in your family. And she's taught not only here in the United States for a number of decades, but also spent at least a decade in Europe, as part of the Department of Defense Overseas School System, in which she was the coordinator for Minority and Multicultural Studies. So welcome, 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 Rosita. I look forward to having this conversation with you and sharing it with our Zoom audience. I want to start at the beginning because, you know, that old line from the Wizard of Oz, it's always best to start at the beginning. But instead of following the yellow brick road, I'm going to take you back to 1910 and the birth of Anna Pauline Murray, and ask you if you can tell us a little bit about the family into which she was born and where she was ultimately raised during her child years and her adolescent years.
Well, it was very common in that day around 1910 for children to be born in their family home. So Aunt Polly was born in the family home in Baltimore. And a year after that, my mother, Rosetta, was born. And lastly, the youngest boy, Robert, was born. Aunt Polly was one of 6 boys and girls born into the family. The mother was Agnes Fitzgerald, and she was a nurse, and their father was William Murray, and he was an educator and also a principal. So very young in life, when Aunt Polly was about 3, my grandmother, Agnes, died very unexpectedly of a cerebral hemorrhage. And of course, as you can imagine, any family with 6 children, especially a 1, a 2, and a 3-year-old, this was very tragic. Aunt Polly had been named after Agnes's favorite sister, Anna Pauline. So Aunt Pauline came from Durham to try to help the family decide what should happen now. The father actually wanted to take all 6 children, but family members felt that would be too much for him. And my Uncle Bubba, who was Lewis Murray, and his sister Rose decided that they would take the younger 3 and the father would take the older 3.
And where did that leave Anna Pauline or Paulie Murray to live?
Well, Agnes had asked her sister if anything ever happened to her, would she please take her namesake niece with her? And Aunt Pauline had agreed to that. Aunt Polly had actually lived with Aunt Pauline for about 9 months when my mother was being carried by their mother. And so Aunt Pauline said to this 3-year-old child, you can stay here with your siblings, or you can return to North Carolina and come and live with me. And without hesitation, Aunt Polly said, I want to go with you to Durham. And so that changed the course of her life and probably the course of the other 5 as well. So soon after that, Aunt Pauline and Polly took a train to Durham. And until Aunt Pauline, until Aunt Polly left for college, she lived in Durham with her Aunt Pauline. Now that setup was very different than her brothers and sisters. The brothers and sisters that stayed in Baltimore were living a middle class or upper middle class life. They wanted for nothing. They had everything that they needed. And when Aunt Polly went to Durham, she lived without any children being around in the home. She lived with aged grandparents and 2 aunts. She immediately noticed some of the differences between Durham and Baltimore in terms of what we commonly call Jim Crow. The opportunities for people of color were different, and their treatments were outwardly different. She decided very early on, as she went about the neighborhood or went to visit people, that she was not going to ride a bus because she didn't want to sit in the back of the bus. They always made sure that their meals were prepared and they had a little basket or something to take food along, because they didn't want to be relegated to the back of a restaurant or to be told they couldn't be waited on because they were Negroes or they were colored. And when Aunt Polly started school and she could go on her own, she would walk 3 miles to school because she did not want to be relegated to riding in the back of the bus. So
Now,
she,
these the schools that where her Aunt Pauline was teaching? Pauline did?
well, initially, when she was not able to go to school because she was so young, she would go with her aunt. It was a situation where she was allowed to sit in the classroom, but she couldn't speak, she couldn't talk, and she was not to participate in what they were doing. But by being there for a year, even at age 4, she actually learned to read by listening to her Aunt Pauline teach the first graders how to read. But then as she was older and she was going to, I guess, what we would equate to junior high school and high school, she walked herself. And she had a job very early because she wanted to have some money. And she saved up and she was able to buy herself a bike by the time that she got to high school.
Well, it would be
But
fair to say that the family there in North Carolina was not wealthy. I know you said the other children in Baltimore were living pretty well, but what about Pauline living there with her aunt, the teacher?
no, they were definitely not wealthy. The two teachers in the two aunts who were teachers made about $65 a month compared to about $500 for teachers in white schools. Also, Aunt Polly recognized the fact that she, in her schools, were given old books and used books. They had furniture that might be in disrepair. The buildings that they actually went to school in were old and often just, in her mind, looked like shacks. So she noticed immediately as she was walking to school that she didn't have the kind of materials at her school that she saw little white children carrying to their schools. And she noticed the difference in the buildings that she went to.
Is it fair to say these schools were not integrated at that time?
Oh, absolutely not.
And did that include the colleges as well as the elementary schools and the high schools?
Absolutely. Everything basically was segregated in North Carolina as well as most of the South. So she had made up her mind very, very young that she was not going to stay in North Carolina a day longer than she needed to. And
well, I'm gonna cut you off a little bit, and unfortunately, I'm probably gonna be cutting you a lot because we're going to cover a lot of territory in this limited amount of time we have. So I apologize already if I seem I'm obstructing the story. But I just want to bring out another little point here. I know you said her mother died when she was about 3, and that's when she went to live with her aunt and her grandparents. Was she ever able to live with her dad again?
No, she wasn't. Her father, they believe, suffered from typhoid fever, and he was institutionalized in a place in Crownsville, Maryland. And she always said that she would go back to Baltimore and help get him out of there. But before she turned 14, her father actually was killed in Crownsville by a white guard. It was known that he had killed her dad She was only 13 at the time. And he actually got 10 years for killing her father. So she was a true orphan by the time that she was 13, and she never got to see her father again.
Now, when she finished school in North Carolina, you had said a few minutes ago she had made her mind up she was going to get out of North Carolina. Was she able to do that?
She was. She and Aunt Pauline went to New York. She had always had a dream of going to Columbia University, so that's where she set her sights.
Was she able to go to Columbia?
She wasn't able to go to Columbia, not because she was Black, but because she was a female. She didn't know at that time that Columbia was only for male students, as many colleges at that time were either for male or female students. The other thing she didn't know was that as a graduate of a high school for Black students in North Carolina, she only had 11 years of education. And in New York State, you not only had to have a 12th grade education, but you had to be able to pass the Regents. So she determined that she would make up the classes that she did not have in a one-year period.
And was she able to do that?
She absolutely was. Half of the classes she needed, she actually went to class with other children, and the other half she studied independently on her own. And then she took the Regents and passed with flying colors and was able to enter Hunter College, where there were just a handful of other persons of color.
Now, Hunter was an all-female school, is that correct?
And it was free. And that's why she was able to go there, because Columbia had suggested Barnard, but she had no idea the amount of money that it would take. And the family could not have afforded that. She went there to study writing, but was told by one of her early professors she would never be a writer. And so she changed to English and was able to graduate.
And you recall when she graduated?
Yes, in 1933. And that number might sound familiar to people because that was during the United States Great Depression. So she came out with a degree and was thrown into a pool of many people with PhDs and masters and quite a bit of experience, who were losing their jobs because the United States was in such a depression. So she was not able to get a good job at that time. And she was willing to do almost anything. So she had a variety of very temporary jobs. And as a result of that, she actually married a gentleman. They thought two people could live as cheap as one. So they were trying to navigate that situation together.
And did that marriage work out for her?
No, it didn't. She realized early on, after a month or so, that that wasn't workable, and they separated amicably, but they didn't divorce formally for many years, but they never lived together after that. And I don't think they actually ever saw each other until they divorced.
Jean, I'm going to ask you to bring up, if you could, on the screen, just the slide number 2 of the young years of Pauli Murray, while we continue to talk a bit, and then I'm going to ask you to switch to slide number 3. Okay, this is, but let's go back to 2 first. Okay, and these are some of the pictures of the family, correct, in that lower left-hand corner,
Right.
there, with her mother and her siblings.
Her mother's seated, Aunt Pauline is standing, her father is on the right, and her 3 sisters and 2 brothers are all shown there.
Okay, and we have 3 other pictures of her in various different all the while she's relatively young. And very often, it's my understanding, she preferred dressing in pants, except for like when she had to do something formal or go to church. Is that correct?
Right. Her Aunt Pauline was very understanding of her needs and wants of clothing. And so she allowed her to wear pants whenever she wanted, except on Sunday or when they went to church. And that was very unusual for females at the time. And in fact, many times she pretended to be a boy when she thought it was safer when she was traveling around the United States and things of that nature.
Well, I'm going to ask you to give a real brief synopsis of a story that I read about, and I suspect you know about her. Well, I guess while she was at her 100 years, she and a friend took a trip all the way to California, and then she got her aunt was ill, and she ended up coming back by hopping freight trains.
Absolutely. Hopping freight trains, sleeping in freight cars, hiding out because it was quite dangerous. There were a lot of hobos and other people who were unemployed. And also when you wanted to get off the train, be that when you heard somebody coming and looking for people who were hiding, they would have to jump off the train after when the train was moving. But she actually did that and did quite well as it. She dressed in a Boy Scout uniform, and the other people on the train assumed that she was a boy.
And didn't she ultimately write something about, I know she was a prodigious writer, a story about traveling across the country in I think like 10 days on a dime or something like that?
On a dime. She certainly did.
Now, Gene, we can go to the third slide, and then I'm going to ask you to, so you can clear your screen and come back to us. Okay, and that's also her in those young years.
Yeah.
Okay, let's clear the screen and go back to us. I'm going to hop ahead now. After she's come out of Hunter College, and it's the Depression, and it's hard to get jobs, and I know she had a variety of jobs because she had typing skills and so forth, but she was also, I understand, a waitress, and it was a real economic struggle, if I'm correct.
Very much so. She worked for the Y in New York. She was a switchboard operator, and she would do, and she sold subscriptions to magazines and things of that nature. Anything that I think was legal and moral, she was willing to do to try to survive. She often also had to live with a group of people and live in places that, you know, she wouldn't ordinarily do.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead a few years to about 1938. When my understanding is she tried to get into the University of North Carolina to get a master's degree in social work and faced some challenges in doing that.
She did.
A little bit about that.
She was determined to try to register at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in 1938. And she was rejected then because of her race. My family, the Smiths, who were the slave owner parts of the family, had given quite a bit of money to UNC for scholarships. So she thought, being a part of that family, she would certainly be able to get a scholarship herself. And of course, her grades and her degree from Hunter should have opened some doors. But all schools and other public facilities in the state were segregated by state law, as was the case across the South. And the case was broadly publicized for several reasons. She herself wrote articles about it, and it was in the local newspapers, though they never mentioned her name. They normally just said a Negro student. She was also afraid that possibly the KKK or other organizations would have a problem with her relatives who still lived in Durham. So she didn't want to bring any obstacles down their way. Her two aunts were public school teachers. They may have lost their job. She had asked Eleanor Roosevelt to help her in getting in the school, and President Roosevelt had actually written a letter for her, but because of the law, she was not allowed to go, and even with their pressure or their interest in her, she was not accepted. So she finally decided to give that up, and she was never admitted to UNC, though later on they actually wanted to name a building after her, which she said no thank you to.
Now, and this is where the family homestead is right there in Durham, correct?
Absolutely.
And there was land, I think it's through her mother's and your grandmother's family, the Smith family. They owned her. And also at this time, if I recall correctly, there had been a decision by the Supreme Court involving a law student, a Black law student in Missouri by the last name of Gaines, where they wouldn't let him into the state law school. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held that they could not bar him under the separate but equal clause because, theory of, Plessy v. Ferguson and so forth, because there was no equal opportunity in Missouri because there was no Black law school. And my understanding is that Pauley thought this was going to be the avenue for her getting into UNC in part, since North Carolina didn't have a graduate social work program either. But that seemed to fell on deaf ears at UNC at the time.
It certainly did.
And didn't she ultimately go to Thurgood Marshall and try to convince him to appeal it and got turned down?
She was, and one of the reasons was the NAACP basically took cases that they thought they could win. And they also took cases that they thought would have a broad impact. And Aunt Pauley had been in New York for 4 or 5 years, going to college, going to high school, finishing up that year of high school. And the NAACP was concerned that she would not be considered a North Carolina resident. And so that was one of the reasons that she felt that they wouldn't take the case. The other reason was that she had been involved with some organizations that some people thought leaned too much to the right. And so they didn't want to take her for that reason as well. And she never was sure if it could possibly have had anything to do with her gender issues as well. So there were 2 or 3 reasons why possibly the NAACP didn't pick up and support her on that.
I want to get to another issue because, obviously here, the racism or the Jim Crow was right in her face and with the University of North Carolina. I want to get to another incident, though, that occurred a little bit later in Virginia, when my understanding is she and a friend were trying to get to Durham to visit her family there. And there was an incident on the Greyhound bus when they got to Petersburg, Virginia. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So when people of color rode buses, they could sit wherever they wanted to as long as they were north of the Mason-Dixon line. But when they reached the Mason-Dixon line, they were often instructed to go to the back of the bus. And so the 2 of them were instructed to go to the back of the bus. And
this is around 1940, correct?
In 1940.
Okay.
Way before some of the famous cases that most people have heard about. So one of the problems was that the seats that they were relegated to sit in were broken. And so to sit on them would be very uncomfortable and could have cut cut them or hurt them. And so they said that they didn't want to move, and there were plenty of extra seats in the part of the bus where white people were allowed to sit. They actually refused to move, and the bus driver called the police. There were several commotions in relationship to that, but eventually they were taken off the bus and put and taken to jail. And if you can imagine, they were put in a jail where it was dirty, filthy, bug infested. There was like a bucket to go to the bathroom. There weren't sets of sheets and towels and things to use. And Aunt Polly, being Aunt Polly, had grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil and had hidden it in a pocket. So before she got off the bus, she asked one of the other passengers of color to please contact her family and let them know what had happened, because they were expecting her to arrive in Durham. And that gentleman actually did do that and found out that they had been taken to jail. So they were released from jail, but once the
But let me just stop you there for a second. Before they got released from jail, you know, part of that note to that person, didn't she ask him to have the family contact, I think, Walter White at the NAACP?
right, she
And
did
then the local NAACP started sending lawyers there to assist
exactly,
her.
and she had diagrammed the bus to show where everybody was on the bus. She had labeled it. She had written up like an abstract of what had happened, and had was able to give them that information.
And this was, she was not a lawyer at this time. She hadn't gone to law school yet.
Absolutely.
And she's just detailing everything. You know, it's like, no, I'm not only not moving to the back of the bus, I'm documenting this, which is what they teach you to do in law school. You know, create a record, figure out who your witnesses are, and so forth. Also, wasn't there another thing I'm seeming to recall on this with the bus driver was handing out little forms to
right.
the patrons on the bus as witnesses, but not the Black patrons.
Right. There was a thing that the bus company had called an incident report, which you often use when there's an incident. So he asked all the white passengers on the bus to write what they had observed while they were on the bus in relationship to Aunt Polly. And when Aunt Polly asked for the same form for the two of them and for the persons of color who were on the bus driver absolutely refused. So that was another problem, of course, as far as she was concerned. Now, once they were released from jail, the Justice of the Peace had changed from the actual situation. In other words, they did not want to say it was because they were relegated to the back of the bus. They just charged them with being out of order and causing a problem on the bus. So that was another reason that the NAACP lost interest in it. But she had written a letter, as she often did. That was one of her methods of activism, to write anyone of importance to help her, or to write anyone of importance to complain about things that she thought were not just. So when they had to go back to jail at the time of the hearing, that time they were given clean linens, towels, soap, and the things that should have been there the first time when they stayed. And in the end, they were released. But it shows you how before she'd ever been to law school, and before other people had similar situations, she had advocated for herself and others of her race. Also, you may not or your audience may not know that while she was in law school, we hadn't really talked about her going to Howard.
Okay, but that's our next step. So you can segue right into that. But before you get into where I think you're going with this part of while she was in law school, if we could just talk a little bit about what she faced when she first got. This is Howard Law School, correct?
Right.
Okay, and this is around, I guess, around 1940, 41?
41.
41 when she gets to law school. Were there many females in her class?
Initially, there was one other, but she did not last. So Paulie became the only female in the freshman class. And she was so excited to have gotten the opportunity to go to Howard because of Howard's reputation, because it was in Washington, D.C., and because it was considered a mecca of Black intelligence. She had no idea when she got to Howard, instead of being embraced by her fellow students, she then became a victim of being surrounded by all males, and they treated her very differently than the other men in the class. They made fun of her. They wondered why she came to law school. What would a female do with a law degree? And when she had these before her time explanations or interpretations of the law, they made fun of her because it was so different than everybody else's thinking. So she actually coined that as Jane Crow, looking at what Black people experienced as people of color, as so when it was against females or against her, she actually called it Jane Crow instead of Jim Crow. She also had an incident when she was in law school that the men always had a smoker. And at this smoker, there would be high-powered lawyers and people representing high-powered white firms who would come to meet the Black students who would get the possibility of being identified by these attorneys. And she was not allowed to participate in the smoker because she was female. And she was not happy about that and made sure that everybody knew it. Also, while she was at Howard, she organized with the junior NAACP restaurant sit-ins, which were very effective. They sat in at 2 different restaurants in Washington, and they were actually able to cause the management to allow Black people to eat there because of their efforts. However, and this was in 43 and 1944, way before some of the other sit-ins that we have heard of. And that,
well, the sit-ins we all hear about from the 1960s and so forth.
I
think 20 years before this, you know, she's part of the people organizing and participating in these sit-ins.
That's true.
And they were successful.
However, after a couple of years, they had to, or after the 2 restaurants that they actually integrated, they had to stop because Congress told the Howard University administration if they wanted to get their annual millions from Congress, they better shut those students down. And so the choice was made by the president of the university to shut those students down. And so that was the end of their sit-ins, but they still had 2 successful sit-ins under their belt.
Now, while she was at law school, I know you say she ultimately was the sole female in her class.
Mm-hmm.
She graduated from Howard Law School. Do you recall what her rank in her class was?
Absolutely. She was the first and the top student her junior year, and she was the top student her senior year. And as the top student, it was a tradition that they would receive a Rosenwald scholarship. And that Rosenwald scholarship was always used to go to Harvard Law School for the top student. So, of course, she was a top student. She applied to Harvard, thinking that she would be admitted. She also had the Rosenwald scholarship. And again, she hit a brick wall and was not allowed to be admitted to Harvard, not because of her race, but because of her gender. She, again, even used her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt and President Roosevelt to write to support her being considered, but Harvard would not change their rules, so she was not able to go.
But then they suggest she go to Radcliffe, which had no law school.
Right.
So, but this didn't stop her from continuing her education after Howard. My understanding is she was able to go to University of California at Berkeley, Boalt Hall, which is also a very prestigious law school. And she got her master's in law from Boalt Hall. Is that correct?
She did, and immediately passed the California bar. And as a result of that, she was appointed the Deputy Attorney General of the state of California when she came out of Boalt Law.
And wasn't she the first Black female to be hired by that office?
She was.
And this is back in the 1940s still.
So
that is just incredibly impressive. All right, Gene, if you could just bring up slide 4 for a moment here. Okay, this is the more professional Pauline Murray. I know you just mentioned about her passing the bar in California. My understanding is she ultimately went back to New York, though, and passed the bar there as well. Isn't that correct?
That's true.
And I'm really going to skip far ahead because I know in the 1950s, she ultimately is working for one of the most prestigious law firms, Paul Weiss and Rifkin in New York, associate. So things were moving quite along with that. But I want to ask you about something else before we get to the law firm, because I know it wasn't all working for big law firms. I know your Aunt Polly had a lot of different interests in a lot of different places that she worked. But one of the things that I noticed, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about, was some work she did for the Women's Division of Christus Service of the Methodist Church on the state laws on race and color. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, she was asked to write about the state laws. Each state had their own laws, and they thought, maybe she would do a small book or a pamphlet about it. But she wrote a very comprehensive book called State Laws on Race and Color for the entire United States. And the book was hundreds of pages long. And even Thurgood Marshall coined it the Bible of the civil rights era, because it was used by lawyers from coast to coast when they were representing people in different states in relationship to civil rights and what have you.
So basically, this was she identified all the Jim Crow laws in the United States and put them in this book, which I know you said hundreds of pages. I think it was like 700 pages long.
700 pages.
She pulled this together.
Absolutely.
And Thurgood Marshall called it the Bible. Now, Thurgood Marshall, I know she'd had some run-ins with him before, in terms of trying to get him to help out with some of her appeals and so forth. But I want to get to another issue that came up, I guess, in part. We all know about Brown v. Board of Education and the incredible brain trust that went forward before the Supreme Court and got Plessy v. Ferguson overturned, and the schools, at least as a matter of law, ordered to desegregate. But part of the winning argument in that case, I understand, came not from that team, but from someone else that you're related to. Is that true?
Pauli Murray.
Okay. And can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, when she was a junior in law school, one of the things that she talked about was the fact that the thinking that the NAACP used and most attorneys used in relationship to civil rights issues was really not the way to go. What they did was, if a Black person wasn't allowed to go to a white hospital, they would look at that as an individual case instead of the broader case. They also were not using the 14th Amendment. So she had discussed what she thought, and she had written about it for her senior thesis paper. She turned it into Spotswood Robinson, got an A on it, left law school, and luckily he put it in his desk. And when the situation came up for Brown versus the Board of Education, he remembered that situation with Aunt Pauli and the conversation that they had had, and he went to his desk, and there was her paper, and that was given to the team at the NAACP to use, and it actually became the core of theory for what they used before the Supreme Court. And she did not know that. She wasn't given credit in terms of her name being on the brief. And it was years after that that she found out that they had actually used that.
Well, now I'm going to jump to a different area. Jean, you can stop sharing of the screen right now. We talked quite a bit, and I see our time is flying by here now, so I'm going to start moving even quicker. You mentioned several times about her communicating directly with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm trying to figure out, this young woman from, North Carolina who's traveling across the country like a hobo and struggling, not having much money. How is it she's got this kind of a relationship where she can reach out and speak to the First Lady of the United States? I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady for a lot of years because Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president for a long time. But how did that relationship start out?
Well, it started, she had a theory. One person plus one typewriter constitutes a movement. So anytime she wanted to express her opinions about something or her disdain about something, she would write on her typewriter and send it off to who she thought the appropriate people were. And it began and has become rather famous by writing President Roosevelt. He seldom answered her, but she began to send copies to Eleanor Roosevelt of the correspondence that she sent to him. And sometimes she would write him directly. And Eleanor did go to him many times and discuss some of the things that Aunt Pauli said. But Eleanor Roosevelt would also print some of the excerpts from Aunt Pauli's letter into her weekly column. So this is how it began. And eventually they got to meet. And they were very close friends for 20-some years until Eleanor Roosevelt died. And everyone in the family knew it. Most of my older aunts had gone to the White House to meet Eleanor Roosevelt or to have tea, as it were.
And did you actually meet Eleanor Roosevelt with her?
I certainly did. It's one of my fondest memories of Aunt Pauli. I was graduating from what then was called junior high school, and people were planning their special congratulatory trips and experiences. And I told Aunt Polly I wanted to come to New York and meet Mrs. Roosevelt. And she says, "Oh, I wish you told me before because I'm going to see her next week." And so I called her up and told her I'd got permission from my dad to come, and I had a new outfit to wear and a new camera to take with me. And could she pick me up at the train station so that I could go? She said, "Well, I have to check and make sure Mrs. Roosevelt doesn't mind." I said, "Okay, I'll be on the train." So I did take the train by myself, which was a big accomplishment in my family. And I met her in New York, and we went to Mrs. Roosevelt's. And of course, I was spellbound. And there were a lot of important people there, including the prime minister, who was not the prime minister at the time, but Golda Meir was one of her guests. And Mrs. Roosevelt stopped and introduced the two of us and gave us tea and cookies and what have you. And all of the adults went on with their high-level political conversations as though either I wasn't there or one of the group. And so I was like floating on cloud nine. And it's been one of the most wonderful experiences of my life, and I will never forget it. And it is
I'm gonna butt in a little bit here because I know we're getting really pressed for time here, and there are a couple of things I really want to fit in here a little bit more on top of that wonderful story, but it sort of segues into the feminist side of your Aunt Polly, because she was very active in the women's rights movement. And if I understand correctly, Eleanor Roosevelt initially had her placed on the JFK's Commission on the Status of Women in the early 1960s, recommended her for that. And that she also played a major role in not only one of the co-founders of the National Organization of Women with Betty Friedan and other females, but also played a vital role in ensuring that Title VII had in it language including sex as what you're not allowed to discriminate against in employment. And if you could just give us a little bit about that in the time we've got.
Well, women, very similar to people of color, were really treated legally like second-class citizens. So it was very important to Aunt Polly that women were elevated to the same status as men. And her theory was, if you leave out women and females in your legislation, you're leaving out about 50% of the population. So it was important to her to have that incorporated. And she was able to do that and to always fight for female issues.
Well, and in addition to that, Gene, I'm going to ask you to bring up the slide number. I think it's 6 that has the book on it. Obviously, you co-authored this book on Pauli Murray, and it covers a lot of the things that we've talked about here today and a lot more. 2 things that I just want to touch on very briefly in the very limited time we have left. And you've mentioned this a couple of times here where there were issues about her gender identification. And I understand that that was something that Pauli Murray struggled with internally for a long time in her life, in terms of seeing herself as a biological female, but believing that she was indeed a male. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Right. Well, first of all, being Black and being female at that time, she felt that those kinds of issues needed to be kept quiet. So it was not a public talking about those issues, but she did see from psychologists and medical personnel information about her feelings, and she wondered sometimes if perhaps she had also been born with male genitalia or what have you. She was, this also became a problem sometimes where she had to be hospitalized herself for what it did to her emotionally. But she did share with the family what turned out to be the weekend before she died. So it was almost like on her deathbed when my Aunt Mildred, her daughter Bonnie, and Bonnie's daughter Lisa went to visit her in Pittsburgh when she was very ill with pancreatic cancer. And Aunt Polly shared with them her lifelong issues about her feelings toward women and what she had had to do throughout her life, and let them know about the love of her life, whom she called Rennie, who had died in 1973, which was a pivotal point for Aunt Mildred, for Aunt Polly, when she lost Rennie in her life. And as many people know, at that point, she decided to give her life to God, and she entered the seminary.
And she became an Episcopal priest, is that correct?
Became not only an Episcopal priest, but she was in the first group of the official women priests and the first African-American female priests in the Episcopal Church. And in 2012, she was made a saint in the Episcopal Church.
And you actually attended.
Alvin, I don't want to interrupt. We have about 4 minutes left. And if you
Okay.
want to close up with some things, we have no questions in the chat. So do what you want, okay?
Okay, great. If we could then go to slide 7. Okay, these are 3. We had it and we lost it, Gene. Can you bring that back up? Share your screen for slide 7. There it is. Okay. These are 3 websites that are really, really wonderful. We know we were just sort of, telling you a little bit about Pauli Murray. It's hard to cover anyone's life, but a life as full as that of Pauli Murray in 1 hour is a really difficult task. And we've covered a lot here, but these websites that we list here, preservingpaulymurray.com, paulymurraycenter.com, and the American Writers Museum, these are all wonderful websites that we would encourage you to look at if you want to learn more. There have been wonderful documentaries. There's one on Amazon Prime. And if you go on preservingpaulymurray.com, you can get the link to that, as well as a number of other discussions with panels and so forth. Rosita is on the board of both of these organizations, and I know they're near and dear to her heart. And in terms of the information you can get there, you can also get through the Pauli Murray Center a list of additional books that you could read. I certainly would encourage you to read the book that on Pauli Murray that was written by Rosita and Miss Jennings. Although it's written in verse and it's written for younger people, but it's a wonderful way to get an awful lot of information in a relatively short book. It's because it's so readable and it's so interesting, and it's very well worth your time. There's also a wonderful autobiography by Pauli Murray herself that is really give you so much detail on that. So really encourage you to read those books as well. Lastly, you can bring up slide 8, Gene. I know we're at the time where we pretty much have to almost shut down, but one of the things that we didn't get to mention about her, we did highlight in bit that, Pauli Murray was someone, when you heard the story about her, taking notes and diagramming things on the bus back in the 1940s. She kept amazing records. She kept journals. And Rosita, am I correct? When you say you visited her house, can you just sort of describe how the books and records were inside that apartment?
She literally had a room with books from the floor to the ceiling, all around all of the walls, then books stacked on the floor, and then bookcases in the center of the room filled with books. And I asked her about all of those books, and she said, these are the books that I've read. And I was mind boggled. In another room would be the books that she was going to read. So she almost always had a book in her hand. She loved the written word, and she loved to read. And as you can tell, her college professor was wrong when she said, you'll never be a writer.
Well, in addition to all of that, she was also a poet. And that's why on this last screen, we have an excerpt from one of her poems, Dark Testament, that I felt was very, very moving. But again, she's got a whole book of poetry that's well worth reading. And her papers, I understand, are at Harvard University and the Schlesinger Library. Is that correct?
Right. She turned over, I believe, 143 boxes of her poems, her writings, her short stories, her sermons as a priest, tapes, and videos. It was just amazing. And it's taken them a couple of years, but they finally put it into some kind of order. So it's a little easier for researchers to go through her materials.
Alvin and Rosetta, we are losing some of our viewers. It is at the hour, so I'm going to stop the recording in a moment, but I would like to remind people this will be available on the Minnesota ASALH website, and the next ASALH Beyond Black History presentation will happen in November on the 16th. Before we leave these two, the comments have been wonderful. Everybody has really enjoyed what you've done. I'm going to, like I said, stop the recording now, but we'll stay online for a little while if there's somebody who would like to say something. So if you want to unmute yourself, I'm going to take the spotlight away from these two. But again, thank you so much for a very in-depth, wonderful glimpse of Pauli Murray. I have put links in the chat if you want to go to any of those websites. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosita.